In today's video, I'll show you how to create a multi-step form. Here are the features I'll cover. For the dynamic indicator, I'll design it to handle any number of steps. Next, I'll show you how to transition between the progress steps. Then, we'll navigate through the steps using the previous and next buttons. Since it's a form, I'll also show you how to validate the inputs for each step. Users won't be able to proceed to the next step if an input is not valid. You'll learn how to manage navigating steps when changing input focus using the Tab key. Here, I can proceed to the next step by tabbing through each input. But if an input is not valid, the focus will go back to that field instead of the next step. Lastly, I'll finish the tutorial with handling the form submission. We'll collect the form data and show a success message after submission. And with that, let's dive right into the tutorial. I'll begin by setting up the basic HTML structure. Next, I'll add the multi-step form and the form title to the body. Then, I'll add a progress container. Inside the container, I'll add the elements for the progress steps. Now, I'll focus on implementing the dynamic steps. In the CSS, I'll set the styles that I want to apply to all elements. Next, I'll define the following variables in the root element. For the body, I'll set it to full height and center the form. As for the form, I'll give it a box-like appearance. Then for the progress steps, I'll remove the list style and use Flexbox for alignment. Here, I'll define a counter and name it step number. Then, I'll add a pseudo element to the progress steps list item. I'll increment the counter here and assign it as the content for the pseudo element. Then, I'll apply the following styles using the variables defined in the root element. I'll also center the content using Flexbox. On the progress steps list item, I'll use Flexbox and center the items vertically. To style the progress steps track, I'll set the position of the container to relative. Then, I'll add a pseudo element within the container to serve as the track. I'll give it a small height and temporary width. Then, I will align it vertically to the center of the progress steps. Back to the progress steps, I'll set its position and z-index to put it above the track. Next, I'll add a temporary border to the progress steps. Here, the width of the steps becomes unequal when the label is too long. To ensure the progress steps are the same length, I'll add the flex property to each item. Next, the width of the progress track should not stretch beyond the first and last step. So to fix the width, I'll define the following variables. Here, the first step is active, so I'll subtract 1 from the steps. Then, the result is converted to a percentage. Next, I'll use this variable to set the progress track's width. Then I'll center the track horizontally using left and translate properties. Lastly, I'll remove the temporary borders from each progress step. I'll use different steps to see how flexible the progress track is. To make this dynamic, I'll use Javascript to adjust the steps variable. Here, I'll select all the progress steps. Then, I'll get the root element and override the steps variable in CSS. Now, even without the steps variable in the CSS, the progress track's width will adjust based on the number of steps. And with that, I'm done with the dynamic step indicator. Next, I'll begin with the step progress. Back in the HTML, I'll add a done and current classes to the progress steps. Then, in the CSS, I'll apply the following styles for the two classes. Both will use the same styles, except the current class has a box shadow. For the progress element, I'll duplicate the styles of the progress track. However, I'll change its background to the main color. I'll also set the z-index so that it's on top of the track, but below the progress steps. Then, I'll scale it horizontally from left to right using the transform property. Lastly, I'll apply a transition to ensure smooth progression. Next, I'll add a transition to the progress steps. Now, I'll make the step progress dynamic in JavaScript. Here, I'll define the current step and set it to the index of the first step. Next, I'll create a function that simulates step progression. Within the function, I will loop through each progress steps. Then, I'll toggle the current class for each step. Back to the HTML, I'll set the current class to the first step. Then in JavaScript, I'll also toggle the done class. Next, I'll select the progress element. Then, within the function, I'll calculate the width percentage based on the current step. I'll use the result to change the length of the progress element. As you can see, the step progress is now functioning. The next topic involves adding buttons for manual navigation. So I'll add the previous and next buttons in HTML. I'll wrap the buttons in a div with a class of controls. Here, I'll also include the submit button. Next, I'll style the buttons in CSS. Since this is not crucial, I'll accelerate it to save some time. For the controls div, I'll use Flexbox to align the buttons. I'll then add some spacing using gap, margin, and padding properties. Next, I'll set the button's flex properties so that the buttons are equally distributed. Back to the JavaScript, I'll select all the buttons. Next, I'll add a click event listener to the previous button. Just in case the button type is not specified, I'll prevent the form from submitting. Then, as long as the current step is greater than 0, I'll decrease it by 1. Next, I'll invoke the update progress function. I'll create this function and move the step progress logic here. Then I'll remove the setInterval function as it has served its purpose. Next, I'll duplicate the code for the previous button and make some adjustments to apply for the next button. Here, as long as the current step is less than the total number of steps, I'll increment it by 1. Now, I can navigate through the steps using the previous and next buttons. Next, I'll create a function to update the button's visibility. The previous button will be hidden on the first step, while the next button will be hidden on the last step. As for the submit button, I'll show it only when the next button is hidden. Next, I'll initialize the multi-step form by invoking the update progress function. And inside it, I'll invoke the update buttons. As you can see, only the next button is visible on the first step. On the second and third step, the previous and next buttons are both visible. Finally, on the last step, the next button is hidden while the submit button is visible. Moving on, I'll work on the form steps. First, I'll wrap the form steps in a container. Then, I'll add dummy content to each step for now. In CSS, I'll set the steps container to display as flex. As for each step, I'll set the flex property as follows. Back in Javascript, I'll select all the form steps. Next, I'll duplicate the progress steps for each loop and modify it for the form steps. Here, I need to shift the form steps position to match the progress steps. Now the form step matches the progress step. Next, I'll hide any content that overflows from the steps container. Then, I'll apply a fade effect to the current form step. Next, I'll increase the dummy text for step 1 in HTML. Here, the steps with fewer content got an additional empty space. This is because flex items will stretch to match the height of the tallest item. To fix it, I'll set the height of each step to fit content. Next, I need to make the steps container height dynamic. In JavaScript, I'll select the steps container. Then inside the update progress function, I'll make it match the height of the current step. Now, the extra space before is removed. And that concludes the step navigation. To validate the form steps, I will add the input fields first. This will take some time, so I'll speed up the process. To make it simple, I will only specify the type and required attributes for the validation. Now, I'll go back to CSS and style the input fields. Once again, I'll fast forward so we can move on to the logic. Back to JavaScript, I'll add a function to check if a step is valid. Inside the function, I'll select all the input fields under the current step. Since I only have input and text area, that's what I specified here. Next, I'll convert the fields from node list to array. Then check every input field's validity. It will return true if all the fields are valid. Otherwise, it will return false. In the next button click handler, if the current step is not valid, I'll prevent the next step. Now, I'm unable to proceed to the next step, unless all the input fields in the current step are valid. And that concludes the form step validation. The next topic covers using the tab key to navigate through the form inputs. Here, when I use the tab key to switch inputs, the form disappears. In fact, the focus moved to the input field in the next step. However, since that step is hidden, I'm unable to see it. To fix that, I'll go back to the JavaScript and select the form. Next, I'll select all the inputs within the form and attach a focus event listener. Inside the event handler, I'll get the focused element. Next, I'll determine the form step from which the focused element belongs. Here, I'll add a condition if a focused step is found. Also, the focus step should not be the same as the current step. If the condition passed, then navigate to that step. The progress step indicator is updating properly, but the form step is still hidden. This is because I'm using overflow hidden to the steps container. To fix that, I'll reset the scroll top and left of the steps container. Now, when I press the tab key, I am able to move to the next step properly. However, navigating form steps with the tab key should maintain validation. So here, I will validate the form step as well. As you can see, when I press the tab key and the current step inputs are not valid, I get a validation error message. And that's how to manage input focusing with tab key. Lastly, I'll end the final step with form submission. To start, I'll create the submission success message. Then in JavaScript, I'll add a submit event listener to the form. Here, I will prevent the form submission if it is not valid. Then, I will collect the form data. Usually, I will send the data to the backend. But since the backend is not covered here, I will just log it to the console. Here, I will mock a form submission using a setTimeout function. After a few seconds, I'll display the submission success message. As you can see, the form submission is behaving properly except one thing. Here, I'll hide all the other elements in the form when the success message is visible. With that, I'm done with the form submission. And that's how to create a multi-step form using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Before we end this tutorial, I'll make a few minor adjustments. And with that, the multi-step form is completed. I hope you learned something and find it helpful. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like and share. Also subscribe to my channel for more content like this.